All right, everyone. Hello here, Lego here, back with another tutorial. And this is part two of the, I guess, series now. At least part two from the video I made forever ago about the tips and tricks I use in Inkscape when I do Gallifreyan artworks. Today I'm back again with some simple tricks that I missed last time, but primarily I'm going to talk about some of the more advanced niche features that I've used whenever I do any projects. Some advanced techniques for double letters, some advanced extra settings for a bit of this, a bit of that. Um, so I'll do the same style as last time. I'll just go through a bunch of stuff, and if I zoom back out here a little bit, you can see that I've once again got a small list here of things I want to go through in no particular order. If you did not watch the part one, it's in the description below. It's not a requirement as such, but the vast majority of the tools and tricks you need if you want to start out with drawing Gallifreyan artwork in Inkscape is going to be covered in that video because that's the basic stuff. That's the stuff I use 95% of the time. This is more like the other 5%, more or less. So without wasting too much time, I'm just going to go right through this list and cover basically what I wanted to do in this video. So first off, some of the basics, some of the real quick stuff. If you find yourself using a tool and you change some stuff and you make some changes to the colors and stuff, and you need another, it always keeps the previous stroke and fill. If you don't want that, if you want your tools to have a certain default every time you pick it up, you can do that just by double click on any tool you want. So if I double click on a circle, for example, a pop-up menu will come up and it'll say that it uses the last used style. If I instead wanted to use a certain style every time, a certain default, I can just set that right here, film stroke, and customize that. So if I always want a black stroke, no fill, for example, I could set that up here. I'm going to use last used style, but this is a preset that you have available for all the tools in your toolbox. So that was just a quick little tip there. Another little tip for the power strokes. If you have some weird shape like this or whatever, a weird shape, and you want to use the power strokes on this, make sure primarily that the overall shape that you want is present before you go and fiddle with the power strokes menu itself. And let me try and show you why. If I apply the power stroke to this, if I just find the power stroke down here, there it is somewhere, there we go. If I have this effect applied, I'm just going to fiddle a bit with it just so you can tell. Here it is. Here it is, as you would expect. And I'll just apply something like that. It looks, it doesn't look good, but it looks the way I expect it to look. If I went about and used this tool, you can see it goes from node to node and it thickens and thins as you would expect. Now, if I decide for some reason to change the shape of this in some drastic ways, maybe I want to do some really drastic changes to the way the overall shape is set up, I'm going to, at some point, when I fiddle around with it enough, actually, I'll just let it speak for itself. I'll just fiddle around with this a bit. Change a bit about that. Now, it might not appear as if a lot happened. It's a bit weird trying to trigger this, but it can happen. And I've done it. Um, I'm just trying to see if I can demonstrate to you what happens if you fiddle around too much with the path after you've applied the power stroke. And I'm not actually certain. Oh, there we go. So what you're seeing here is an example of what I'm trying to trigger here intentionally. At some point, when you try to, I guess, apply some effects at once, like there's a thickness difference here and it's big, and at the same time I'm also trying to skew the entire thing so it makes a sudden churn, and it can't handle that, so it makes these weird sharp corners that shouldn't really exist. And depending on what you do, you can make some really weird stuff. I actually tried earlier today, and I made up this thing that doesn't exist. Oh, never mind. Never mind. But the point is, you should not apply your stroke effects until you're certain that you have the shape you want, because it can mess it up and it can lose completely the shape that it's trying to hold on to, and it can convolute, it can do some weird stuff. I'm over exaggerating way too much here, but it can happen when you're doing simple effects as well. It doesn't have to be this crazy stuff that I'm doing here. So anyway, that's just a little reminder that when you use the power strokes, please try and have the final shape in order first. There's no need to apply the power stroke before you have the final shape. So I'm just going to delete this mess before I go on to the arcs. Now, I covered arcs in the last video. You have a circle like this, you can change these handles here and get an arc. But one of the things that is a bit misleading about this is if I want to do this, take the arc and make it smaller, but still proportionally to the original shape, so it's still concentric. If I want to scale this up and down, no matter how much or how little I have, by using these handles, I'm still keeping everything concentric. It's still scaled relative to the center there. No matter how big or small the actual bounding box is. You can see the bounding box, that's the dashed line there. And if I go to my regular pick tool, you can see the outline is right there. And it has the handles for scaling. And if you don't think about it too much, you might actually think to yourself, oh, well, I'm just going to scale this. I'm just going to hold Control and Shift, and then I'm going to drag on this handle right here. But what happens is that bounding box is not a perfect square, so it scales it proportionally to the actual outline. And that means that even though this is still a fine circle, it's not concentric anymore because you didn't use the scaling handles native to the circle itself. So that's just a little weird quirk you have to remember when you want to scale a circle that's not a complete circle. Don't use these handles. Use the built-in nodes that actually do the handling, do the scaling for you. Last thing from the basic menu is to look at just the strokes. Now, a stroke has a beginning and an end. That's the markers, that the node at the beginning and the node at the end. And then if you have nodes in between, these three categories can be applying effects all at once. These are called markers. You can see them here. If you have a start marker, you can apply one of those. It could be, I don't know, something like this. And the end marker can also have stuff applied. It could be like this. And all the nodes in between, these are the middle sections. You can apply markers to those as well. Something like, I don't know, this. And they just appear like they are on the stroke, but they're actually part of the nodes. So if I change the nodes, I change the placement of the middle markers. And if I add more nodes by double clicking, those will appear as the marker symbols accordingly on the side there. Now for the stroke itself, if I take a stroke, it's usually a complete line. There's no dashes. You can apply dashes just by using one of the presets here, or as soon as you press a preset, you have the actual math used to make it. So this marks the sections of dashes itself and the units of how much space there should be in between. So this is an example of, if I just do something like this, that means that 2 units for a dash, 4 units for a space, 2, 4, 2, 4, 2, 4. It's a bit clearer if I move the rounded edge to a square edge, so you can actually, it looks a little bit clearer that the space is double the amount of the dashes itself. I can add on to this or change this. I can do 4, 4, or I can do 4, 1. So that's 4 units of dash, 1 unit of space. And I can even add on to this by saying 2, 4, 1, and it makes the pattern more complicated. So if I have some custom dash system I want to implement, I can just do that right there. Now, that was the basic stuff. Let's go talk about double letters. In the part 1 video, I did some different ways of doing double letters so that you can have them essentially created no matter how thick or thin the actual outlines are, which is a great tool and a bit of a hurdle for most beginners. But what I perhaps didn't specify in that video is that those methods I showed there was non-destructive, which meant that if I had to change anything about the orientation or the placement or the thickness or whatever, that is still doable. It wasn't locked in. And it didn't get perfect results. Those were imperfect placements because they were essentially eyeballed, but on a very small level. So they weren't geometrically perfect. If you want geometrically perfect designs, then you have to do it destructively. And that's what I'm going to show right now. The simplest way I've found to make destructive double letters in Inkscape, no matter the thickness or combination of thicknesses. So I'm just going to go through this small written example right here. You can take a screenshot of this if you want to keep it, want to reference this in the future, but I'm just going to go through it just quickly. So first off, I'm going to need a circle. So this pattern here, let's get rid of that pattern, make a complete circle, go back to complete dash, there we go. Let's go with 1 thickness there, and then just let's go with twice the thickness, and I'm going to make sure that it peeks out. Just make sure that the smallest letter just escapes the word circle. It has to overlap completely, otherwise it's going to mess things up, but it overlaps there, that's fine. And then I'm going to make a thicker letter just because I can. So let's make this a ridiculous 5. That's gonna be really good. So there I have my double letter. So it's thin, thicker, thickest, and first of all I'm going to make this into a path. So now we have 3 paths. So that was the first step there. I'm happy with the placement. I've converted it to paths. Next step, 2 duplicates of the word circle. So I'm going to make 1 duplicate. I'm going to make that pink. I'm going to make another duplicate. I'm going to make that red, just so you know that there are different versions. And then I'm going to use the difference with the bigger letter. So I'm going to use this, go to path, go to difference, and it doesn't look like anything happened. But if I take this letter away, you can see I've cut it. But it's still one piece. So I need to separate it. And I do that with the break apart. So I just take this and delete it. Away we go. So that was step number 2. Step number 3, duplicate the small letter, then use the difference on the original word circle. All right, I'm duplicating this one. I'm gonna make this red as well, just to make look like what happened. And then I'm going to take this other duplicate. I'm going to put this on top because that's the one I want to cut with. So I'm going to cut with the pink, and I'm going to select both of them. Going to do the difference. Now it doesn't look like anything happened, but it did cut, as you can see here. So it did cut. I'm going to break this apart and delete that because I don't need that. There we go. So that was step number 3. Now we just use the second duplicate on the division, blah, 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 blah. So we have one circle left. That's going to be, did I mess something up? Second word circle division of the small letter. I'm going to make another duplicate. I'm going to make this pink. I'm going to take that on the original. I'm going to use division. I'm going to take, no. Let me just back up a moment. We have just made the duplicate small letter. Then we use the difference. Oh, on the original, sorry. So duplicate. This is a duplicate. I'm going to get the original circle. I'm going to use the duplicate on that. So I mark those up, and then I use the difference. So that cut that one up. Yeah, that makes sense. So what we did was we cut the original word circle using the duplicate, which is, yeah, the difference on the original word circle. So it's just because I can't read. So there we are. I'm just going to break this apart. And there I go. Get rid of this little piece here, don't need that. And this leaves us with just the extra pink word circle left. So the second duplicate word, that's the pink one. I'm going to use a division on the smaller letter. So if I take this, bring it up to the top, and then I'm going to use division on this one there. Take the piece that I don't need, get rid of it. And what we're left with is this piece. Let me just color code this piece, and the black piece. So we have these puzzle pieces left, and those are just paths. So we're going to just unionize those, and there we go. We have ourselves a geometrically perfect double letter. I hope that made sense. Otherwise, you could just follow these steps and play around with it, find your own flow. I'm not too fond of this because it is a lot of steps, but it is the cleanest, fastest way I've found of doing it on the rare occasion that I need it. All right, so unfurled text. That was the first interesting thing. The second interesting thing is this piece right here. This is a little cutout from one of my earlier projects. What you're seeing here is not the typical Sherman Gallifreyan word circles. Instead, what you're seeing are these small segments, you could say, segments of a circle. If I just do that, you could probably tell a bit more. So I have these segments and I write on it, but they're still part of this bigger circle that goes all the way around. So in a sense, it's still circular, it's just these small segments instead. The easiest way that someone might start to use these is actually a bit misleading. So if I start a circle, let's say a big circle like this, I only need this part, right? That's the part I want to write on. So if I take this and I start to write my letters, I might choose to write it. I'm not doing a terribly good job of doing this, but I'm just making some basic stuff here. If I were to do this and I cut it out, something weird happens. What happens is that this shape I'm trying to write on is actually not as big as I think. If I take the fill color, I can get a better idea of how much space I actually have to work with. So even though the circle is able to become this big old thing, because of the way it cuts off at the ends of the arc, I actually don't have a lot of space to work with. So counterintuitively, if you want to write text using this unfurled half arc thingy, where you just write a bunch of words individually on the same circumference, but then cut it up later, you actually need a complete circle to work with, not these circular arcs. You actually need the whole area, because once you start cutting it, you need that extra space for cutting. So I'm just doing some stuff here, but let's say this was the text and I start cutting into the shape. Oh, that was a bit big. Let me just adjust that a little bit. There we go. Let's say this was my text. I can then delete the extra sections after I've cut it. And I do this simply by inserting some extra nodes, double clicking, adding extra nodes, and then I just highlight the section that I don't want, and I click on this option right here, delete section. And I just do that a couple of times. And that's the cleanest, fastest way to get rid of the part of the text that you don't need. It's also the way I make makeshift words, spaces between words. Let's say this was a word and this was a word. I could make a space between them just by adding a note there, adding a note there, and then deleting the section in between. Ta-da, I've just made a space. So this is a word now and this is a word. It's not pretty, it's a bit rough, but it works. And so this is the approach that you actually want if you want to do this. You can't just start with an arc, you need the whole circle. And then you cut away the stuff you don't want afterwards. Now, what if you want to do it on a completely plain surface? No curve edge, just a simple line. Now, a line don't have any fill by definition. So if I were to take a shape and try and cut it, well, it wouldn't go well. It just deletes itself because there's nothing left. So what you want to do instead is take something like, say, a square, and then you write using, say, the bottom line. Maybe this is my line. I want to write some text, blah, 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 something like that. And then you cut into the square, just like you'd expect. And then after that point, I can delete the various segments that I don't need. So that would be that, and maybe I want a stop there. Boom. There we go. Now I've got completely linear text, and it just because I need the space, I need the physical space to have something to cut into. So that's the trick, I suppose. about Unfurled. Now, next thing on the list, that was the advanced techniques from some of the projects I've done recently. Now, for manipulation, I do have a little bit of a thing. Someone asked me about this, so this is my answer. If I've got a couple of different objects on top of each other, like a lightsaber or a lightning bolt, let's just assemble a lightsaber right here. 3 different strokes, 3 different lights, and 3 different blurs. I'm just going to plop those on top of each other. Ta-da! You got a lightsaber, or a neon light, I suppose. If I were to group this together, I can absolutely apply an effect just like I could any other thing. And that was not the effect that I wanted to get. I wanted to get the bend effect, and apply that on canvas. There you go. So by grouping this together, I can manipulate everything individually. It's not pretty, and it's not like easy to control, but it's definitely possible. Um, but I mean, best practice is to make the final shape, just like with the power stroke earlier, make the final shape first and then apply the lightsaber effect or a lightning strike or whatever weird thing you want, because manipulating after the fact, it can be done certainly, but it's not ideal. So that's just a bit about the combined objects groovy thingies. It can work. On that same thing, I want to talk about nodes and node distribution. So I have here a simple stroke. It's got a bunch of nodes in it, but it's a simple stroke. If I take that stroke and apply some jitter nodes to it, I can get an effect like you see either the right or the left. It's a pretty simple tactic. You just make something. Let's say this stroke to path. So now it's got a bunch of nodes. Then I'm just going to add some more nodes. So now you got a bunch of nodes here, right? If I just mark those, go to extensions, modify path, and then jitter nodes, I can essentially push those around a bit. If I go for something pretty conservative like this and apply it, you can see the idea I'm going for here. It takes all the nodes and it just randomizes them a bit to give me something that's not quite organic, but it gives it that randomized feel. So I've used this before on stuff that looks handwritten, and it can absolutely be used to make some cool shapes like a lightning bolt or something. If you made it a bit thinner and played around with the shapes a bit more, you can make a ton of different stuff look really cool with this effect. On the same note, as I showed earlier with the nodes on the paths, if I add an extra node here, any section I don't want, I can mark it and I can go here and delete it. And it won't affect, like, it's still one object. It just has a missing part, which is a huge deal actually, because I can still manipulate each part individually. Whereas before, the nodes, if I change the direction of this node, the handle, it would also affect the next part. That's not happening here because the next part is non-existent, but it's still one object, so that's really cool, and it opens up some possibilities that you might not have thought of. So that's pretty nice. On that same node distribution, yeah. So the last thing about nodes I want to talk about is whenever you do something like this and you have some nodes, add some more here just for demonstration. So this is my node. If I actually mark up those nodes and go to my distribution tool, I can actually distribute these nodes the same way I could objects. So I can put them all on the same line horizontally, or I could do the same line vertically, which is a mess. Or I could, for some reason, if I wanted to, distribute them evenly. in one or the other direction. So you can actually manipulate those the same way you could objects or even individual nodes if you hand mark them out. So that's pretty cool as well. Now, mesh gradients, I'll only briefly talk about this because I actually go way more in depth on this separate tutorial on glass effects, where I use mesh gradients in part to make these really nice glass reflections and other details to give it a really 3D effect. So if you're interested in that, just see the description. I've got it below. Um, that covers conical gradients and the mesh gradients in general. I cover pretty much as well. The only thing I want to note here is that if I take some weird shape and say this is, let's say I want to apply a gradient to this shape, and I go to my gradient tool, 2 rows, 2 columns. That looks pretty good. And let's say I want to apply this, so I go to my fill, and then I go to the mesh gradient. There you go, we got a gradient going. But you can see the points on this gradient. If I just mark up these 4 corners and I make them red, and the center here, make that, I don't know, green. But you can see the corners, they're way out there. They're not actually applying that much color because they're, I mean, maybe this corner, but the others, not so much. So if I want to conform the mesh to the actual shape of this, um, like this, and I put this way in there, what you'll see happening is, even though I'm making the mesh conform to the shape of the object, some of the object is disappearing. Why is that? That's because the boundary of the mesh gradient actually moves with it. So I need to manipulate the handles so that you can see there's a faint outline of a blue object there, a blue boundary box. I need to have that bounding box not touch the object. If you've ever seen or worked on a mesh gradient and this happened to you and you don't know why, it can be really frustrating. But this bounding box is where the color is. So if you have a part of the object is still there, but there's no color on that part of the object because the mesh gradient doesn't cover it. So I need to move this mesh outside the boundary of the object until I have everything the way I want it. Um, so that's a bit of a weird thing where you need to be aware of that the mesh you're making, if you um, mess with the outline of that mesh, it needs to be bigger than the object itself. Otherwise, it's going to be invisible. And I think that is pretty much everything I wanted to talk about for mesh gradients. Now, for the rasters, a little thing I want to talk about rasters. I've used rasters images before as textures, and if you don't know, you can modify these the same way you can modify objects, colors, gradients, hues, saturation, whatever. You can do the same thing here by marking the object, then going to extensions, raster, and then there is the HSB, hue, saturation, brightness, and you can mark out in the same way as everything else. You can see it went darker. Let's go with 60. It went even darker. And apply that to those as well. And it works just fine. Now, why would you want to do that? Well, you might want to do that if you were to use it in, say, a carving, where you carve some stuff into some other stuff, like wood or rock, stone, whatever. To give it that darker shape, you might want to manipulate the original texture. So that's a way you could do that. This is a cutout from a project I've made some time ago. But you just need to know that you can do that in Inkscape if you want to. And in that same vein, let's talk about the clips and masks quickly. If I want to apply this texture to an object, how do I do it? Let's do a circle and another circle. So let me just take these and say gray, like something like that. So let's take this texture And first off, here I'm going to put it on top of the object, and here I'm going to actually put it below the object. So these are the two scenarios. If I put it like this, mark the object and the texture below, and I go to path and set mask, it looks like it worked, right? You got the texture, you got the object, but you can also tell that it's actually fainter because, ta-da, if I just move it back, it's actually half-ray transparent, even though it doesn't say that over here. Now, what's happening is it took the values of the brightness of the texture, the picture itself, the pixels, and it took the brightness and the color of the object, and it just blended them together and created some sort of mesh thing with the transparency as a variable. So it has variable transparency right now, and that's probably not what you wanted, although it could be useful. What you actually want is the texture on top of the object. And if I do this, mark them both, and then go to my mask and set the mask, it does what you probably thought it would be. It took the texture and masked it onto the object. So there's no transparency here. Huh. Wait, never mind. What is happening? Okay, so it's still sort of transparent. Or is it just me? No, it definitely is. I actually never noticed that before. But the point is, this is the object. You can see it's a circle. I still have the handles, so I can do whatever I want with this. A it's still a vector object. It's just got a texture masked onto it. This is still identified as a picture, so you can't do anything with this in terms of the usual manipulations. This is the way you want to go about it. If you want a pure crop, just take any shape you want, really, and then instead of doing the mask, you just do a clip. That's how you do a an opaque actual just a crop, really. So if that's what you want to go for, I mean, it's texture. Technically, it's still applying a texture, but it's not. It's a bit on the nose, I think. This you can still manipulate in any way you want. Even though it's faint, it's still there. So if I mean, you can still see the effects there. So this can't these cannot be manipulated, but this one can. And I used that to do some maps in a previous tutorial where I just put it on top. There's no transparency there. I'm not sure why this is actually transparent. I'm gonna have to look into that because by my memory it shouldn't really be when you do it like that. But that's an issue for another day. Next up, we have the filters and LPEs. So this is the last thing I want to talk about. Some useful stuff in the filters and the LPEs. So if I take a circle, bam, that's a circle. I can go to the filters, I can go to the shadows and glows, and I can do a drop shadow. Now, this might not look very impressive if it just looks like this, because you could do it a shadow easy peasy. But what I just showed there was actually you could do inner shadows as well, and it looks like it's punched into the background there. That's pretty cool. You can do the same thing as before, but without the actual object. It looks like it's just raised from the ground. And you can do the opposite of that, where you just press the ground downwards without the actual object. You can also cut away the object entirely and just have a shadow. I don't know why you would do that, but you can do it. But especially this effect. This effect, you can do it by hand. no problem. It's just going to be a few extra steps, and depending on the scale and the complexity, this might just be a quicker option. So I just wanted to highlight that. That's a pretty neat effect if you need it in a pinch and don't have time to do it yourself. That's one effect. The second one is one I love very, very much, and it is the ever-loving, let's choose a darker color, the ever-loving texture of watercolors. I love watercolors. You can use those as smoke. I use it a lot of the time as smoke, and you can tell that when I move it around, it actually changes the seed of the smoke, which is a bit weird, but I need to point out that you can manipulate this by changing the the blur, and once you're happy with it, you can do one of two things. You can either go to path, object to path, or you can take this thing and say this is the one I want, and then you can scale it. Once you scale it, it locks it in. Don't ask why, I don't know. But once you have this, it won't change again. But smoke effects, I use that a lot. It's a bit intensive, but I love it. Um, Last thing I want to talk about there, directional blur. Yeah, okay. So if you have an object like this, you can use the usual blur, sure, but it blurs in all directions, which you might expect. But under the filters and the blurs there, you can actually do a blur in either one or the other direction. So this is a blur in horizontal, and I can do something vertically, and you can see it only goes vertically. So if you need that for some reason, there it is. It's pretty niche, but pretty cool. I'm just going to leave that there. It looks it hurts my eyes. Go away. Right. That's it for the filters. For the path effects, I do really like this hatch effect. It's just controlled essentially by two nodes, and I can demonstrate this right now if I just take a shape like this, and then I go to the path effects, and I find the hatches, and it just does this. And if you go to the nodes, you have these two green ones. They control the density and direction. And I think this is pretty cool. I use this a few times, most notably in the maps, where you can see there's a bunch of stitches there in the background. It makes sense in the whole project, but I that's an example of where I use those. I quite like it. It's pretty cool. The other effect that I want to highlight right here is the pattern along path. So if I take one random object like I don't know, this one random thing, and I make a path like that, I can take the object, I can copy it, go to the path, go to my live effects, and then I can find the pattern along path, which is somewhere here. There we go, pattern along path. And over here I can choose take it from my clipboard. And it's going to take it from my clipboard, and it doesn't look that good until I start to manipulate the original, because this is dynamic. So there you go. And this is a solid fill, but this is an outline because this line had a stroke. It did not have a fill. If I instead went and did this, there you go. And you can do this for all sorts of paths. So if I do this, I can take my fill, copy it. I can go to this object and apply the same effect, copy it there, and there you go. We have a circle of this thingy, and I can manipulate it. I can rotate it maybe. I want to, maybe this looks kind of cool, I guess. Something like this. And I can just plop in a big old sun there, and wooda, we're in business. We got a sun. That's a pretty neat effect as well. And it is, as I said, it's dynamic. So once you highlight this, you can see these blue outlines show where that is used currently. If I want to lock it in, I just go to path, object to path, and then it's locked in forever. So that's all I wanted to show you. It's a bit much, I know, but I did it as quickly as I could. If you want to know more about both Inkscape and the tools and tips and all the stuff that there is to know about Inkscape and the different techniques that there are and all the other stuff that I don't personally use, a good place to start learning is by searching up Logos by Nick or Iron Echo Design or Sweater Cat Designs. These three people are really, really good at what they do. I've learned a ton from them. And as I said, I have a glass effects reference in the description below if you want to go specifically about some of the mesh gradients that you can do to get that 3D effect. And the most important thing I can probably recommend is if you want to learn more about Inkscape, or at least in relations to the Gallifreyan artwork that we do, or you just want to hang out and do some Gallifreyan, well, the Gallifreyan Discord is the place to go. Link in the description. And with that said, this is pretty much what I wanted to show. So that's it for now. Bye. Oh wait, no, sorry. If you have one last thing, if you have questions about the effects, or you have some idea that maybe I didn't cover everything that you wanted to covered, if you want me to dive deeper into any of these effects, or if you have questions about other effects, other techniques used in Gallifreyan that I didn't cover, or you're just confused about something, then please just drop a note below, or jump on the Discord and start yelling at me. Maybe I'll do some deep dives if there's anyone who needs it. So that was my last thing to say. So, bye.